Thank you, Perry, and thank you all of you for spending some time with us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Kathy, Julia, any of the other first-timers who have never phone banked with EVP before, you are so welcome here. We are so happy to have you here. And it looks like Ed, it's his first time. Welcome, Ed. So what we're going to do is, as Perry mentioned, start with a quick briefing on Nevada. And so I'm going to share my screen here, if you don't mind. Here we go. And we're going to start with a Nevada briefing. Then there will be a brief Q&A session. Then people who are already trained callers, so they know what to do and they can just get the login credentials and get going, we'll give them that data and they can go. Then the others can stay on to get trained with Perry and then start calling. And at the end of the session, we always come back and have a little bit of feedback. Tell us how your experience was. We debrief on some of the stuff that we learned, and hopefully this will be informative and impactful. And so without further ado, I will start the Nevada briefing. What we are not going to do today is go into a lot of detail about how the Environmental Voter Project identifies voters, how we turn them from low propensity voters into consistent voters. If that's something that interests you, please let us know in the chat. We can provide some materials for you. But for today, we are not going to provide an introduction to EVP as much as a briefing on this Nevada data. And I do like saying Nevada data, forgive me. But just very simply, I will say what the Environmental Voter Project does is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet they are not voting, and we know that from public voter files, and then we deliver behavioral science-informed messaging to turn them into more consistent voters. So we are not in the business of trying to change people's minds and get them to care more about climate and the environment. Instead, we're finding the people who are already with us and they need behavior change messaging. They need a behavioral intervention. And right now, almost 5 months away from the midterm elections, we are working in 17 states, but we are particularly focused on a few, including Nevada. And this is why we think Nevada is so important. First, we have identified 95,627 already registered voters in the Nevada voter file who have a really high likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but listing it as their #1 priority over all other issues. Yet, they have never voted in a midterm election before. So I know that was a mouthful. So let me say it again, but a little bit quicker. 95,627 already registered climate voters who have never voted in a midterm before. So these are the people we are targeting this evening and over the next 5 months. Some of these people never vote. Some of them vote in presidential elections, but not midterms. But what we know is that all of them need this behavioral intervention. They already care deeply about climate and the environment. They're just kind of iffy when it comes to walking out their door on election day and casting a ballot. All right, what does that number mean? What does 95,627 mean in the context of Nevada elections? Well, the last time there was a midterm election in Nevada, only 975,000 people cast ballots. So this target population that we are asking you to reach out to is so potentially big that it would equal almost 10% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm election in Nevada. Moreover, this group of environmentalists who don't vote in midterms but are already registered is so big that it's twice as large as the margin of victory in the 2018 US Senate race in Nevada, and almost 2.5 times as large as the gubernatorial margin of victory in 2018. 95,000 is a big number in any state, but in Nevada, it is enormous. And as you can see, pretty much everything is tight in Nevada. The US Senate seat is currently rated by Cook Political Report as a toss-up, not just competitive, not just lean one way or the other, but a pure toss-up. The gubernatorial race, pure toss-up. Nevada only has 4 congressional seats. 3 of them are pure toss-ups. Their state Senate is 12-9. So if Republicans win 2 seats, they are in charge of the state Senate. The state Assembly is Democrat 26 to Republican 16. So if Republicans pick up 5 seats, it is tied. Nevada is the ultimate battleground, maybe along with Pennsylvania. If you haven't already been hearing people talk about Nevada, I promise you, they're gonna start doing it. All right, who are these 95,627 non-midterm environmental voters in Nevada? Well, you see the age breakdown. No surprise, people who care deeply about climate and the environment are younger than the overall population of registered voters in Nevada. And so you'll see we've broken out age distribution of all registered voters in Nevada, but then also the age distributions of our targets. Surprise, surprise, they're much younger. But one thing that may not have been obvious to you is, see that 50 to 64 age range? Only 4.6% of our target population is in that range. And that's actually something we see in a lot of states. Gen X, and in particular older Gen X, does not care that much about climate and the environment. And so what we are seeing in a lot of our data is not just that the younger you are, the more likely you are to care about this stuff, and the older you are, the less likely you are. No, that's actually not true. As you'll see, people who are 65 and up make up almost as large a percentage of our target population as people 35 to 49. Now, part of that is just because it's a larger age grouping, but there really is this dip among older Gen Xers that we're seeing. Now, there is not gender data in voter files, there is sex data. And the sex data, as you'll see, has a whole lot of unknowns in Nevada. That's because in Nevada, it is not required to report your sex when you register to vote, like it is in a lot of other states. And so actually the sex data that we have in Nevada is obviously missing a whole lot of information. So there's not much you can tell from that. Finally, the racial and ethnic breakdown. I want to say a little bit about the terminology that you see here. We are using the same terminology that is found in the voter file. This is not the terminology that we would use or do use as an organization, but we think it's important to report exactly what's in the voter file. And so they use terms like Caucasian and African American and Hispanic and Asian and Native American. But we do see some very clear trends here. Our target population is much less white than the overall population of registered voters in Nevada. That's not unique to Nevada. We see that in pretty much all of our states. Our population of target voters is significantly more Hispanic and Asian. Now, in the voter file, Asian means Asian American and Pacific Islander. It's all of that. But our target population is slightly less Black than the overall population of Nevadans. And so it's just some interesting things that we're finding about this target population. Disproportionately Hispanic AAPI and much less likely to be white. All right, I'm gonna push through here because we got a lot of data and I want to get to your questions and then obviously get to turning these non-voters into voters. I want to drill down on those 3 toss-up seats in the US House because there aren't a lot of competitive US House seats after this latest round of redistricting. What you're looking at here is the 4 newly drawn congressional districts in Nevada. Now that top district, that northernmost district, that's the 2nd congressional district. That has a partisan lean of Republican plus 13. That means when all else being equal, when there is a national election, the people in this district vote 13 percentage points more Republican than the average American does. Then that middle district, that is the 4th congressional district. That is a partisan lean of D plus 5. Pretty darn close. And then the 2 teeny southernmost districts that are really clumped up against Las Vegas, those are D plus 2 and D plus 4. The Democrats in control of Nevada got really aggressive with gerrymandering this year. I'm fairly certain, I don't make many predictions, but I'm fairly certain that come November 9th, Nevada is either going to have a lot of egg on their face, or they will have made a very aggressive bet that paid off. But regardless, what is abundantly clear here is that Democrats have been really risky with their gerrymander. And there are 3 seats here, which is a big deal when you only have about 25 competitive US House seats, maybe 30. There are 3 seats here in Nevada that are pretty much just toss-ups. They're up for grabs. And in particular, in those 2 southern districts, the D+2 and D+4, look at how many of our EVP targets are there. 24,550 in CD1, 28,000, more than 28,000 in CD3. In elections where maybe 60, 70, 80,000 ballots will be cast, those are big numbers. So again, this is an enormous opportunity for the Environmental Voter Project and our target voters, and most importantly, our volunteers, to have a big, big impact. Finally, calling is a better option in Nevada than it is in almost every other state. When we look at this population of environmentalists who are registered to vote but do not vote in midterms in Nevada, over 70% of them have landlines or cell phone numbers in the voter file. That is a huge percentage. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that Nevada, the Nevada caucus has become a really, really big deal in presidential cycles. So there are a lot of campaigns getting all this voter data and throwing it in the voter file. It also has to do with the casino industry trying to get a lot of data about people and that being available out there in the public. But for whatever reason, there are a whole lot of our targets who we can reach over the phone. On the downside, it's a lot harder to canvass in Nevada. People live in gated communities, and even people who don't live in gated communities live in a place where it's like 120 degrees in the middle of the summer. And so it's not always easy to knock on their doors. And so all of this stuff put together shows not only the opportunity we have with these voters in Nevada, but why calling is so particularly important with them. And so right now we've got this primary election coming up on June 14th. Why are primaries important? Well, they're important for who we elect, but even when it's not in doubt who is going to win a primary, the cheapest, best way to get someone to vote in November is to start getting them to vote in their primaries. And every single person we get to vote in this June for the first time is now almost certain to vote again in November. And just to let you know, this is such fresh data that I couldn't even throw it in a slide. We are getting daily updates from the voter file on people who have had their ballots accepted early. 3,792 of our targets in Nevada have already voted early and have their ballots accepted. 3,792 people who have never voted in a midterm general before, let alone a primary, let alone early for a primary. Those people are certain to vote this fall. They're certain to vote this fall. Now, don't worry, we've pulled them out of your calling universe. You're not going to be calling them. But that's the power of this early contact. And once we really, really try hard to get these people to vote in the primary, then we are going to obviously start working on the general election, where all of this underlying data is still going to be the same. Those congressional district, those state senate, state rep, US Senate, gubernatorial races are going to be crucially, crucially important. All right, I'm going to stop there at precisely 17 minutes past the hour. Ren and Perry, I hope you noticed this. Oh, now we're at 18 minutes past the hour, but perfect timing, and now we're ready for some questions.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Nathaniel, for that. If anybody has any questions, if you can raise your hand in Zoom, or feel free to also just post the question in chat. So just, yeah, and Ren or I will flag it. Okay, we have a couple hands raised. Let's start with Paula. Paula, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. You're still muted, Paula.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. I just want to know, I can't do it tonight. Is there another time that will be good, say later this week, to make the calls?
Yes, Paula, thank you for asking that. By signing up for this, we will make sure that that you get details for further calls. Now, it is important that you be trained before you make calls. If you
I've done this a lot. It's okay.
Okay, great. So yes, we will have the information in an email that goes out to people so that you'll be able to log in and make the calls. Thank you for asking. Thank you.
Great. Nancy Emerson, if you can unmute yourself.
Hi there. I just wanted an explanation again of what toss-up meant.
Thank you, Nancy. So in this particular instance, what I'm referring to is the Cook Political Reports analysis of these races. And what they do is they have congressional races or Senate races or gubernatorials that are pretty much, definite Republican, definite Democrat. Then what they do is they isolate the ones that they consider to be competitive. And what they do is they break them into 6 categories. Likely Democrat, lean Democrat, 5 categories. Likely Democrat, lean Democrat, toss-up, lean Republican, likely Republican. So what toss-up usually means this early in the cycle when there aren't that many likely voter polls for them really to analyze is what they're doing is they're looking at the previous vote records and voting history in those districts, and they're looking at the favorability ratings of incumbents. And when throwing those together, they think, you know what? We can't even say that this district is leaning Democrat or leaning Republican for this particular candidate. So all of that stuff is thrown into the mix. And to give you one bit of nuance, a good example of how they constantly sort of update their prior assumptions is the Pennsylvania state primary was held a few weeks ago. Cook Political Report was viewing that gubernatorial race as a toss-up. But then when Doug Mastriano won the Republican nomination for governor, they changed it to lean Democrat because that Republican is tremendously unpopular. Does that mean that it is absolutely or likely Democrat? No, but every time they get a new bit of information, like a primary or new polling, they update their priors. And all of these races are so close, they can't even say that it leans one way or the other. It's what they call a pure toss-up.
Great, thank you, Nathaniel. Rita, feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, Nathaniel, can you dive a little more into what you said about the gerrymandering, that they were aggressive? I didn't know how exactly to take that. Did they do gerrymandering for the Democrats, or did they try to do it more even? It looked like they packed maybe that one district with Republicans. I'm not sure.
There we go. That time I forgot to unmute myself.
I know a little something about that. I live in the
so to answer your question, Rita, when I was saying aggressive, what I mean was they really didn't pack any Democratic districts. The idea was to try to get as many districts as possible that Democrats could win with just that like 2 to 5 or 2 to 6 or 2 to 7 margin. And so they pushed everything up into that R+13 district. And there were some other maps. There were some other maps that they were looking at. And so this is what is thought of as, I mean, a lot of people have described it, well, they really got like far out over their skis. This could come back to burn them. But it's something that you would have seen Republicans doing a lot of in 2009 and 2010. Republicans didn't do that this time around. Republicans played defense in a lot of states. And if they had an incumbent who was in an R+7 district, rather than turn it to R+4 and see if they could pick off a second district in a state, They said, you know what, let's preserve our gains and give our incumbent an R+10 or R+11 district. What Democrats in Nevada did was they said, you know, let's see if we can turn 2 somewhat safe seats into 3 gettable seats. Now that is really painting with a broad brush, but that's what I meant by an aggressive gerrymander. Another place where you could see that was in New Mexico. New Mexico, what I think a lot of people were expecting were 2 safe Democratic seats and 1 safe Republican seat. Instead, the Democrats in charge drew it so that it's like 3 gettable but kind of risky seats.
It's going to be interesting.
It is. It is.
Great, thank you, Nathaniel. There's been a couple of questions on the chat. One of those questions is how easy it is to vote in Nevada. For example, do they have mail-in ballots, same-day registration, etc.?
Really, really great question. So Nevada now mails ballots to every registered voter. This was something that they did for the first time in 2020, but it was unique just to coronavirus. And then with legislation that came afterwards, they made it permanent, or as permanent as you can make these things in today's environment. Who knows what will change? You guys have seen how tight a state Nevada is. But now every registered active voter, and active in Nevada means pretty much the same thing as it does in many other states. It means you have voted in one of the recent federal elections and have not had mail sent to your house that goes unreturned or unanswered. And so registered active voters all get mailed ballots. You'll see that mail was delivered to voters in mid-May. It varies a little bit from county to county. Usually Clark County, the really big county, gets their ballots out a little bit sooner. But that makes it much, much easier. They also have in-person voting, in-person early voting. So not only is everybody getting mailed a ballot, but they have the in-person early voting, and then they have election day voting. So there are a lot of options, but they're kind of new. Obviously, 2020 was kind of unique, but there are a lot of people in Nevada who I don't want to say need to be retaught how to vote. It's not like voting is getting harder like it is in places like Texas, where reteaching people how to vote is extraordinarily important. But there are a lot of people in Nevada who don't know all the options that they have available to them, especially for a midterm. I mean, no one's been mailed a ballot for a midterm in Nevada before. I believe that's true. So it is relatively easy in Nevada logistically, but there are still also obviously local issues, and sometimes polling places aren't in the easiest locations, especially in very rural areas and on tribal lands. But by and large, compared to the other 49 states, Nevada's doing a good job making it easier for people to vote rather than harder.
Great. Another question on chat. This person, feels uncomfortable phoning. Will there be carding? I'm assuming they mean postcarding and texting opportunities for Nevada.
So we will not be texting for Nevada for a whole bunch of legal reasons. Some new restrictions handed down by mobile carriers really increases the liability for any organization that is texting voters who have not previously opted in. It's a very long discussion that I'm happy to get into detail on offline. There are some organizations that have chosen to continue texting. That is fine by them, but they are taking on not only liability, but we have reason to believe, well, we are being told by mobile carriers that many of those texts are not actually being delivered. And we don't think it's fair to our volunteers to ask them to text people if many of their texts aren't being delivered. As far as postcarding, we don't think we will be postcarding into Nevada this year. We're choosing where we will do our fall postcarding right now. We are just finishing up a campaign into Colorado. We are pretty sure we're going to be postcarding into New Mexico this fall. We don't think there will be other states, but there might be. But we will absolutely be sending direct mail ourselves. We will be sending digital ads. For volunteers in Nevada this fall, it will probably just be calling and canvassing. But in other states, there will be postcarding as well.
Great, thanks, Nathaniel. We're gonna do one last question. And this came in the chat. It's kind of more broader than just Nevada. What have you found is the most effective way to get friends and family who care, but say they're too busy or just not motivated enough?
Whew. How much time we got picked now? No. Very, very good question. Very, very good question. So one of the biggest mistakes we make, and I use we sort of in a broad societal sense, but certainly people in the broader progressive movement in particular, is that we think the most appropriate way to convince somebody to do something, and oftentimes the most effective way, is to try to rationally convince them of the importance of voting. And that almost never works. So don't worry, I'm going to get to what you should do, but first let me just stress what you should probably not try to do. And that is try to rationally convince them that voting is important because they care about X, or voting is important because it's going to be really close and their vote's going to make a difference. Study after study after study has shown that even though that makes logical sense to us, it actually doesn't work. It really just doesn't work. And if we had the time, I could go into dozens of randomized control trials proving to you that that does not increase turnout. Instead, the stuff that tends to work best is not to treat our interlocutors as rational beings, but rather as social beings, or maybe even more precise term is societal beings. People who are part of peer groups, families, friends, schools, faith communities, work communities, and they build personalities for themselves in their peer groups. All right, I know I'm speaking in really broad academic terms. What does this mean in a practical sense? It means when you're talking to your friends and family and trying to get them to vote, use peer pressure. Use other societal norms that you know they buy into. If you can't get your dad to vote, well, what do you think he cares about? How do you think your dad wants to be viewed? Does he want to be thought of as a good father or a good grandfather? Is that an important part of his personality? Well, then appeal to that. Appeal to who these people are, or maybe more importantly, who they want to be and how they want to be seen as a way to get them to vote. And to tie it into the messaging that we use on most of our phone banks, this is why we do a lot of very simple messaging around just asking people if they intend to vote, and if so, how. The reason we do that is not because we're just trying to keep a tally board. It's based on pretty serious behavioral science, which is if you get someone to promise to do something, and then you follow up with them right before the election and reminds them that they promised to do something, well, you're taking advantage of one of the strongest societal norms we have, which is that most of us want to be thought of as honest people who keep their promises. And so that's what we're doing when we're talking to people who by definition have never voted in a midterm election before and trying to get them to tell us, oh yeah, I'm going to vote. It's like a trap closing on them. And now we can follow up with them right before the election and say, hey, Perry, just want to remind you, last week you said that you were going to vote, and we know it's important for you to follow through on your promises. So that's how you can get your friends and family to vote. Figure out how do they want to be viewed? What is an important part of their personality? And can you leverage that? Can you say, you want to be a good grandfather? Well, be a good voter. Vote for your grandkid. Or you told me 3 weeks ago that you thought you were going to vote, and I'm going to hold you to your promise. You want to be an honest person. Stuff like that. That's how you get these people to vote. Will it work all the time? No, of course not. But we know it works better than pretty much anything else.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Nathaniel. That's super helpful. I hope all of you who are listening there now understand why we are calling Nevada.